The US thought it was protecting its steel. What it actually did was break its own supply chain, squeeze its own manufacturing sector, and hand Canada the playbook for the next industrial cycle. When the United States slapped a 50% tariff on steel and a 35% tariff specifically targeting Canadian imports, it sent a clear message: protect American metal, no matter the cost. But that cost turned out to be far higher than anyone expected, and not just for Canada. It triggered a meltdown that hit the heart of American manufacturing, especially in cities like Detroit, where steel isn't just a material, it's the foundation of everything.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
And with no buffer left in the system, the market panicked. Aluminum prices jumped more than 70%, turning the US into one of the most expensive places in the world to buy the metal. That cost wasn't absorbed quietly, it was passed directly down the chain. Car prices, appliances, infrastructure projects, all of it got more expensive. And all of it traced back to a policy move that was supposed to stabilize things. Detroit, already on the edge, took a direct hit. Automakers scrambled to source materials. Suppliers laid off workers. Factory schedules were slashed. The message was simple: without access to affordable, stable steel and aluminum, the rest of the economy stalls. The protectionist shield backfired. Meanwhile, on the other side of the border, Canada didn't just react, it pivoted. Rather than beg for exemptions or patch holes with short-term fixes, Canada used the moment to reset its industrial strategy. It rolled out a $1 billion decarbonization effort, directly aimed at modernizing its steel and aluminum sector. Not just to keep it alive, but to make it future-proof. The idea was straightforward: build metals that meet the world's new demands, low carbon, environmentally compliant, and globally viable. That move changed everything. Because while the US was stuck playing defense, Canada went on offense. It tightened import standards, limited Chinese steel, and rerouted its exports away from the US and into Europe and Asia. The goal wasn't just to survive the tariff storm, it was to build an economy that doesn't need the US to thrive. That shift aligned perfectly with Europe's CBAM carbon border adjustment mechanism and environmental trade policy that essentially taxes high carbon imports. Canada's hydro-powered steel and aluminum, with dramatically lower emissions than US or Chinese competitors, slid in as a premium product, not just compliant but preferred. And that's where the strategic divide between the two countries became clear. The US doubled down on tariffs, thinking short-term pain would lead to long-term manufacturing strength. But the pain didn't fade, it spread. Canadian manufacturers suffered initial layoffs, yes. Around 500,000 Canadian jobs are tied directly to US trade. But the country redirected. It used policy to build sustainability, not walls. It emphasized supply chain resilience, not dependency. And while the US tariffs tried to insulate domestic industry, they exposed how fragile that industry had already become. That fragility hit hardest in aluminum. When inventories disappeared and surcharges piled up, it became obvious how reliant the US was on cross-border flow. The tariffs didn't fix the problem. They froze it. With prices soaring, manufacturers either paid more, shut down, or looked elsewhere. And when buyers look elsewhere, they rarely come back. In contrast, Canada's retooled metal sector is now operating with international demand in mind. It's not just about selling to the US, it's about fitting into a global network of green manufacturing. Environmental regulations aren't roadblocks, they're gateways. European buyers want low-carbon steel. CBAM makes it expensive to ignore emissions. Canadian metals are a strategic fit. The Canadian government backed that with procurement policy. Public contracts now prioritize clean steel. Infrastructure is being rebuilt with domestic, sustainable materials. New investments are coming in, not because Canada undercut prices, but because it matched the environmental direction global markets are moving toward anyway. This is how industrial leadership changes hands, not with flashy headlines, but with infrastructure shifts, supply chain realignment, and quiet strategy. The US responded to global competition with walls. Canada responded with adaptation. Now, there's a bigger question on the table. Is this just a market correction, or is it a full reorientation of North American industrial power? Canada's not pretending it hasn't taken hits. Steel towns saw real layoffs. Border economies were rattled. But the long-term play is clear. Canada is trying to lead the next cycle, not just recover from this one. While the US struggles with the ripple effects of its own protectionism, Canada is banking on clean materials, stable exports, and a growing role in the green global economy.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
That matters when international trade is no longer just about price but also about carbon. The US, on the other hand, now faces a dilemma. It can cling to tariffs despite the damage they've caused, or it can pivot to and risk acknowledging that the original policy might have backfired. In a political climate where appearing tough on trade wins headlines, adjusting course is risky. But not adjusting might be worse, because the deeper the US digs into isolation, the more it risks becoming irrelevant to the very markets that are defining the next phase of global trade. The ones building around carbon accountability, around certification, around environmental thresholds that American metals under current conditions struggle to meet. This isn't just an economic competition anymore. It's a credibility test. And Canada, quietly, has passed that test. It's not leading with brute force, it's leading with standards, with strategy, with infrastructure that reflects where the world is going, not where it used to be. If that trajectory holds, then this isn't just a chapter in trade policy. It's a turning point, a shift in industrial gravity, where resilience and green compliance replace sheer output as the measure of leadership. So, did the US tariffs protect American industry, or did they hand Canada the blueprint for the future? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Are tariffs a necessary tool in a cutthroat global economy, or do they just delay the inevitable? Share this if you know someone still talking about steel like it's stuck in the past. And if you want more stories that break down the real consequences of economic policy beyond the headlines, subscribe. The next industrial era isn't coming. It's already here. The only question is, who's actually ready for it? The thing about industrial power is it doesn't disappear overnight. It shifts, quietly, under pressure, behind the noise of press conferences and tariff announcements, away from the sound bites. And right now, it's shifting north. What started as an aggressive move by the US to shield its steel and aluminum sectors is now looking less like protection and more like retreat. Because while Washington built barriers, Ottawa built infrastructure. While the US tried to freeze out foreign competition, Canada used the cold to harden its edge, transforming its industries into climate-aligned, policy-ready, globally integrated machines. And the numbers don't lie. Aluminum prices in the US rose more than 70% following the tariffs. Inventories vanished. There wasn't just a shortage, there was a vacuum. One of the most essential metals for everything from cars to beer cans, gone. And the message that sent to manufacturers, find a new supplier. Fast. They did. Canada, still stinging from the initial blow, acted fast. It didn't beg for tariff relief. It didn't throw subsidies at the problem in panic. It drew a new map, one where it didn't have to rely on a single trading partner, no matter how powerful that partner once was. Canada's pivot was methodical. It redirected trade routes, inked deals in Europe, and leaned into Asia. It tightened its own borders, to imposing tariffs on Chinese steel, enforcing origin standards, and recalibrating its domestic procurement policies to ensure local, cleaner production wasn't just symbolic, it was profitable. All of it revolved around one central idea: build an industrial base that isn't just surviving global policy change, but thriving within it. Because this isn't just a story about tariffs anymore. It's a story about how environmental standards are becoming the new currency of industrial relevance. The European Union's CBAM carbon border adjustment mechanism is a signal to the world. If your materials aren't green, they won't sell here without a penalty. And that changes everything. Canada's metals, especially those powered by hydroelectric energy, fit into this new framework almost perfectly. Their carbon footprints are low. Their production is already compliant. They don't need to greenwash, they're just ready. And in a market where every regulation is a new gate to access, Canada already has the keys. This is where the US finds itself exposed. It built policy around domestic control, but not environmental alignment. And while American metals can be competitive in cost or scale, they're not aligned with where global markets are going. That gap is growing, not shrinking. At the center of it is a brutal contradiction. The US tried to protect its manufacturing future by isolating itself from the very standards that define that future. Detroit's struggles aren't theoretical. The tariffs meant production delays, price surges, and layoffs. Auto manufacturers already adapting to electrification and supply chain shocks now had to contend with metal shortages they didn't cause and couldn't control. the idea that these tariffs would strengthen the backbone of American manufacturing. It aged badly, because strength in today's market doesn't come from walls, it comes from agility. That's what Canada tapped into. It saw the disruption, acknowledged the damage, and chose transformation over resistance. Steel plants are being modernized with lower emission technologies. Aluminum production is being optimized around hydropower and digital efficiency. These aren't experiments. These are billion-dollar transitions backed by real policy, real funding, and real market access. And now, Canada's not just exporting metals, it's exporting strategy. Other countries are watching. They see how Canada weathered a protectionist storm and came out with a stronger, greener supply chain. They see how clean metals command premium prices in Europe, how environmental standards are no longer a regulatory headache, they're a competitive advantage. This is what makes the moment so defining. The US had a chance to lead in green industrial policy and instead, it chose a reactionary stance. Tariffs, surcharges, isolation. A policy rooted in fear of competition instead of confidence in innovation. That fear has a cost. Canada's steel and aluminum sectors were once deeply dependent on US demand. Now, they're looking at a diversified portfolio of buyers, with markets that value sustainability and long-term contracts. And that stability makes investments easier, scaling more efficient, and policy alignment simpler. It's a long-term win, not just an economic one, but a geopolitical one. Because in the age of decarbonization, industrial strength is no longer just about volume, it's about compliance, flexibility, and trust. Canada is building trust with trading partners through transparency and sustainability. It's leaning into international norms instead of trying to fight them, and that earns not just market share but influence. Meanwhile, the US is stuck recalculating. It knows the tariffs cause domestic pain. It knows manufacturers are frustrated. It knows that green standards are now global and inescapable. But reversing policy isn't easy. Politically, it's framed as weakness. Economically, it requires investment that hasn't been made yet. Strategically, it means acknowledging that Canada quietly outmaneuvered them. The question now is how long this imbalance holds. Because if Canada's current path continues, it becomes more than just a regional shift. It becomes a blueprint for post-carbon industrial leadership. And if the US doesn't catch up fast, it won't just lose metal market share. It'll lose its seat at the table where the rules of next-gen manufacturing are written. This isn't just about steel beams and aluminum sheets. It's about how countries respond to disruption, how they adapt to policy shocks, how they leverage environmental rules, how they reposition their economies for the next cycle. Canada's message: don't just survive policy change, capitalize on it. And that strategy is already working. The metals Canada now exports are commanding premiums in Europe. They're gaining traction in Asia. They're being integrated into trade agreements that reward low emissions inputs. Canada's not just participating in global supply chains, it's shaping them. Back in the US, the fallout continues. Manufacturers are still paying the price of higher materials. Small businesses along the border are still reeling from lost contracts. And political leadership is still clinging to a trade philosophy that doesn't reflect the realities of the modern economy. Tariffs might have made sense as a pressure tactic, but as a long-term industrial strategy, the results are in and they're not great. If the US wants to reclaim leadership in this space, it's not going to happen through more walls. It's going to require a policy shift, real investment in decarbonization, a recognition that environmental compliance isn't a burden, it's a passport to modern markets, and maybe a little humility. Because Canada didn't need a global announcement or a flashy industrial plan to make this pivot work. It just needed to read the signs and act. That quiet efficiency is exactly why this moment matters. It's not just about whether US tariffs worked. It's about what Canada did next. How it used adversity to evolve. How it built something resilient in the middle of a crisis. And how, without shouting, it might have just taken the lead in an entirely new kind of industrial game. So what happens now? Is this a temporary tower shift? A rough patch for the US before it rebounds? Or is it the beginning of something more permanent, a moment where industrial leadership in North America no longer automatically means the US, but instead points to the country that saw the storm coming and built something greener, faster, smarter? That answer's still unfolding. What's striking is how quietly this shift happened. There were no dramatic press conferences, no global campaigns announcing Canada's rise, no victory laps, just a series of deliberate, well-timed decisions while everyone else was still arguing about tariffs. And that's the point. While the US was treating trade policy like a blunt weapon, Canada was thinking like an engineer, adjusting the structure, reinforcing the weak points, and designing for what comes next, not just what's breaking now. It's not flashy, but it's effective. Because when the US imposed those tariffs, it expected to give American steel and aluminum a boost. What it gave instead was a jolt to Canada's long-term strategy, one that pushed them to decarbonize faster, diversify sooner, and detach themselves from the volatility of US trade policy. In other words, it forced them to grow up and grow out, and now they're reaping the rewards. European buyers are choosing Canadian metals not because they're cheap but because they're clean. Low-carbon, hydro-powered, CBAM-compliant metals that slot directly into green construction, electric vehicle supply chains, and climate-aligned infrastructure projects. These aren't temporary wins, they're structural. Meanwhile, US industry is still fighting its own policies, still paying more for materials, still watching production timelines stretch and contracts shrink, still trapped between wanting to protect domestic jobs and unintentionally driving up the cost of keeping them. The irony is brutal. A policy meant to restore American industrial independence actually exposed how deeply interconnected it was with Canadian supply. That's what happens when policy is reactive, not strategic. Canada saw the trap, and rather than fight to get back in the room, it redesigned the room entirely. The trade routes are new. The markets are global. The compliance standards are higher. The pitch is simple. If you want metals that meet tomorrow's rules today, you come to Canada. And make no mistake, these changes aren't temporary. Infrastructure doesn't pivot on a dime. Once a supply chain reorients itself, especially one based on environmental compliance, it rarely comes back. Long-term contracts, green certifications, and trust-based trading relationships don't just shift overnight. They settle in. They define the new normal. And this new normal doesn't revolve around the US anymore. Which means if the US wants to remain a serious industrial power, it has two choices: adapt to this new reality or risk falling behind it entirely. Thanks so much for watching. If you made it all the way to the end, you're officially part of the small percentage of people who don't just click away, and that means a lot. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me your thoughts, your ideas, or even what you'd like to see next. I read every single one of them, and your feedback genuinely shapes the direction of this channel. If you enjoyed the video, tap that like button. It tells YouTube this content is worth sharing. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next upload. We've got more exciting videos coming, and trust me, you'll want to be here for them. This channel is just getting started, and your support helps it grow faster than you realize. Thank you again for spending a part of your day here with me. Stay curious, stay motivated, and as always, take care of yourself. Until next time, I'll see you in the next video.